Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randal Baier. Today we'll be discussing scholarly research that we've decided to examine. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randal.
Thanks, glad to be back.
One of the first things I'd like to do is talk about the work of Maxine Green, who just passed in the last couple of weeks, who was a fabulous teacher educator at Teachers College. And just one of the most literate people. And she wrote the foreword for this interesting book called Embracing Risk in Urban Education, Curiosity, Creativity, and Courage in the Era of No Excuses and Relay Race Reform. It's by Alice Ginsberg, but the foreword is by Maxine Green, who is just one of these extraordinary things. And her opening sentence, I think, is just wonderful. To embrace risk is to open spaces and experience for the play of wonder and imagination. There we go. It involves the willingness to face the unpredictable and at once working to identify a range of untapped possibilities. And that's, I've also got other books here, Landscapes of Learning, where she suggested there's a place in teacher education for foundations people whose fundamental concern was opening perspectives on the many faces of the human world. And that is just, and that's what she's talking about, is in terms of the landscapes of learning, is to be aware of where you are.
It's true.
Speaking of which, we got the Most Imperfect Union book, which...
Yeah, this is quite something. A graphic novel, A Most Imperfect Union, a contrarian history of the United States, by Ilan Stavans and illustrated by Lalo Alcaraz, authors of Latino USA. And some great, wonderful, iconic, what do you call it, reflections in here. Reflections on iconic aspects of American history, but also cartooned or graphically illustrated with scenes that we understand from our own history. I mean, pictures of the Statue of Liberty and Teddy Roosevelt going up, some hill during the Spanish-American War. John Brown of the anti-slavery Uncle Tom's Cabin. I mean, all these images that are from newspapers, from famous photographs that become iconicized, I guess, can I say that? And this is a history of American politics and nation.
A lot of the conventional sense of American history on its head.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, he came from Mexico to this country, and one of
the writer, you mean?
Yeah, the writer.
Right.
Who's a professor. And at one point, one of the characters in this pretty serious graphic book says, well, how can you do that? You just came from Mexico. How can you write, critical
of the U.S.?
Of the U.S. Which reflects a certain very limited understanding of what it is, But and as he says, and historians know, history is the story that people tell.
Yeah.
And if only a limited number of the powerful are telling the story, they shape the narrative for everybody else in that culture.
Well, I think this is what like, for instance, I'm looking at a picture of the recent Occupy movement, and we are the 99% and the 1% and the people that did Occupy Wall Street and Occupy various other cities, and that anonymous face of the Guy Fawkes kind of mask that was used. And so he's picking up on images that are very well known, but taking that image, and as an image we reflect on it, and it kind of has almost like a collapsed history itself in terms of the pictures we saw, the stories we heard on the news or read in the newspaper, and yet the commentary turns that on its head in a certain way, with its own interpretation of what that meant.
Well, there's stuff about how this country was, when it was founded, there were already native peoples here.
I
It
saw.
wasn't a new world.
Oh,
It
well,
was a
that's
very old world.
of course. And I was talking with an anthropologist recently about situations in our own research and whatnot, and the term came up about globalized, and how communities in, say, the mountains of some country. I was in Indonesia. It's surprising how globalized it is, and in fact, it's been globalized a very long time. Globalization, in some ways, maybe in its modern impact, globalization might work faster, just because of communications and transport and telecommunications, but the world has been globalized in many ways for a long, long time. There's been internal trade in the mountains of Africa, Asia, and even the United States, South America, whatever. By foot, people going through the mountains doing trade for a very for eons. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, the way we look at this kind of
People have been living on this
internal.
continent for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And then some dude comes in and chips and, oh,
Yes.
this is the new world.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Guess who the immigrants were who didn't speak the language and didn't think they needed to learn the local language? I mean,
And whose disease has killed off a lot of the
Yeah.
native peoples.
yeah.
But-
So this is I guess, an alternative history, but also one that I guess looks. I don't know. I would say, just briefly, from looking at this, there's a certain sympathy for the issues in American history that have sort of been negative. There's still not sympathy for the negative, but sympathy for the struggle of the country to overcome.
I'm trying to tell a bigger story, or
Yeah.
a more complete
Right,
story.
right.
That includes all the people who've been left out.
Yeah.
Which is also an important thing in the scholarship on history. Is who was left out of the
Well,
story.
who writes the history and who has control?
Yeah.
Who has control of the information
Yeah.
for that
it is-
history?
He's got devastating impact.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, because it's a graphic book, it can do things like you're pointing out with visual images and juxtapositions of things, and he deliberately does that to dramatize the points that he's making.
Yeah.
So, let me see.
Well, I mean, you can look on this page right here, where it's the page of the Great Depression and the food lines, and the famous picture of the immigrant mother with the babies by Dorothea Lange. Not immigrant, but Dust Bowl mother. And those pictures, of course, come from Life magazine and things like that. They're now put in a graphic form. But then he interprets and says, who were the people that were without?
Well, he brings in things like W.E.B. Du Bois, as a groundbreaking theoretician of race, who said the problem of the 20th century is the problem with the color line. In many ways, he was right. I mean, you don't find it necessarily in American history.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not. It's more and more talked about now, but.
And there's the visual images of what Abraham Lincoln looked like. They're saying he's not a Ryan Gosling. So there's some really hilarious things, but. And how the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, took its lyrics from the poem Defense of Fort McHenry, written in 1814. I don't think many people even know that,
And the song was some kind of a pub tune. More people, I think, know about the melody. I didn't know what the original poem was.
And
It plagiarized it. And not plagiarized, but borrowed, sampled.
It
Was sampled.
was plagiarized.
Creative
Here's an
sample.
interesting point. He does all these really interesting things. He says, I'm always amazed at how Americans treat their flag like a sacred object, who become incensed when anyone desecrates it, yet they use the flag as a motif on coffee mugs, pencils, watches, and
Oh,
underwear.
absolutely. Right. Right. And of course, all the swimwear and whatever. the images from the 60s of the flag being sort of
We just had
popified, right?
4th of July, and that day was, in 1826, was when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died.
Yeah, yeah.
So they,
That I knew about this because I didn't know it until I saw the PBS special on
so
them.
now we celebrate that day as a day.
No, the John Adams movie with
He is the Louis Sebring Professor of Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College. A Mexican-born essayist and cultural critic, and the author of over 20 books.
mhm.
He's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and many international prizes and honors, including the Latino Literature Prize, Chile's Presidential Medal, and the Ruben Dario Distinction. And the cartoonist is an illustrator and faculty member of Voltis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, and draws the first nationally syndicated political Latino daily comic strip, La Cucaracha. He's received many numerous awards, including 5 Southern California Journalism Awards from the Los Angeles Press Club. And is a writer of Fox Television's new animated show, Border Town.
Border Town.
Yeah, and he talks in here about how difficult it was to do this. You know, that he's got to make cartoon or graphic art that suits usually a pretty heavy-duty, you know, philosophical thing. And yeah, they do a wonderful job. It really, it's really interesting stuff. And he takes this stuff and sets it on his head. And like chapter 5 is the progress machine, you know, when we talk about the New Deal and Citizen Kane and Hugo Chavez.
It's very clever, the images page by page that they pick to choose to exemplify certain, you know, years or time periods or issues.
Yeah. But he's constantly turning things on their head. And I don't know if that's what he means by contrarian, but it's fascinating how he's giving this other view.
Yeah.
It's more of a critique
Yeah.
kind of a thing.
Well, he also has quite an understanding of American popular culture, which he's using as well. He's pulling in images that we've seen, famous images that we've seen. I'm looking at the Hitler page here. He has a very serious image of Hitler giving one of his speeches. Of course, we see that hundreds of times. But he also has a parody of a sample from The Great Dictator movie, where Charlie Chaplin imitated and parodied Hitler. So there's a mix of both in this case, the tragic and, you know, historically disastrous, but also
And I think
the
it's
American
important
approach to it.
that in Germany, the Hitler movement's coming back and to quite a serious extent.
Actually, there was just in Indonesia a serious couple of Nazi I was going to say ramifications, wrong word, that have ramifications. A popular nightclub in Bandung was closed down for about a year. It just reopened, but because it was sort of a heavy metal club, and it had all kinds of you know, swastika imagery and stuff like that. And then some heavy metal rock singer from Indonesia made gestures and put up all kinds of visual stuff that was reminiscent of Nazi propaganda. Got into a flap about that. Yeah. It's hard to say how
Really
serious they were. If it was a matter of saying, you know, this is kind of like, you know, headbanger kind of imagery now, but taken away from the National Socialist, you know, the violent agenda or not. I don't know. It's confusing.
Well, I think in today's media world, people tend to use dramatic, extreme, attention-getting kinds of language,
Yeah.
not realizing it's
The
got
attachment to
limitations.
it, right. Now, if it was skinheads in Skokie, Illinois, there'd be no doubt that that's real, violent, anti-racist, anti-Semitic, Nazi-based, activity. But here,
People are tossing off, allusions to, the concentration camps or Hitler, all these things that historically, the real fact was absolutely awful. And there's even a tendency to kind of gloss it over and just want to use the language. Well, you can't do that.
yeah,
That's
right.
has its own cachet.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, if you want to call it that. Yeah, it has its own atmosphere and truth, and you're mixing things that don't work as mixed metaphors.
well, this next book I found really fascinating. It's brand new. It's
Mm.
called Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. And I like this one too because it just sets things on their head. But it's written by Peter Brown, who's a writer and novelist in St. Paul, Minnesota. Henry Rudiger, who's a James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of Psychology at Washington University in St. Louis, and Mark McDonald, who's a professor of psychology and director of the Center for the Integrative Research on Cognition, Learning, and Education.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating about this is when you study learning, which is also cognition, they make a number of interesting statements that they think that good teaching should be creatively tailored to the different learning styles of students and use strategies that make learning easier. And along with that, they claim that memory plays a central role in our ability to carry out complex cognitive tasks, such as applying knowledge to problems never before encountered and drawing inferences from facts already known. Now, there's a couple of situations they talk about where they talk about the benefit of this kind of cognitive learning.
Mm-hmm.
One guy was flying a 2-engine plane, and the right engine was starting to fail. For some reasons, losing oil pressure, which is not a good thing because it could burn up. So he was watching the oil pressure dropping. When it got to a certain point, he had to cut it off.
Had to feather
He had to cut it off. Well, let it feather, just the prop rotate. But what he knew is now, because of his training and experience with planes, which is all this process of learning, he didn't have lift on his right-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to be very careful about the speed he was going at and how he was positioning the plane. And he managed to make it in an airport. Now he had a new problem, or challenge. And that was that because he didn't have lift on the right-hand side, he couldn't make a turn to the right to come into the airport because his right wing would be down and he couldn't bring it back up.
Right.
So what he did is in his entrance or approach, he made a left-hand turn.
Mm-hmm.
So he had the right wing up because it was going to come down.
Yeah, right.
And then he was able to land the plane.
But he had power on the left wing.
And I thought this is a really fascinating application. Like they're saying, you have to have memory. In other words, you have to really store this information in there. You have to have used it, to apply it to new circumstances.
Right.
And then you have to adapt it to the particular situation you're facing. Now you've really got
Right.
learning at its best.
Well, we've seen the classic story of the chimp who finds a stick to adapt to get into a termite's nest or an anthill. And recently I've seen on the YouTube a test with crows to adapt. It's pretty fascinating actually because they put a situation where a crow has to figure out how to use an object as a tool in order to open something else. And they have to see how it works first before they can then use it in this other. They've got an experiment where the crow learns how to use something, then figures out how to get it and use it to do something different. And so it's a very similar thing. As you're talking, I'm wondering about the things that I've forgotten how to do, or the things that I've forgotten that I know, and it's interesting because I can imagine myself getting in a situation where I have to solve a problem. I can't think of what the problem would be right now off the tip of my tongue, off the top of my head, but the memory would be absolutely crucial. Having been through something, so you know that something like the wing, a trained pilot understands lift, at least should, and remembers that, not only from experience, but also from, I suppose, a certain amount of book knowledge, just knowing the physics of the airplane wing and things like that. But you have to have that as a base in order for you to make a decision or to apply or to come up with a new idea, in terms of ideas. But in terms of solving physical problems, you have to know what your tools are going to be able to do and how that tool will work in various functions.
Another example they had in the book was that these people ran across this guy who had been shot in the head. He was out hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had shot, and the bullet had entered the back of his head. So they brought him into the hospital, and the brain surgeon, saw what was a pretty terrifying thing, which was he knew from his studies and everything, that there is a vein that runs from the brain down the neck, and the bullet happened to be lodged in that vein. Now the challenge is that the vein is so fragile that you can't take stitches in it. And he knew this from past experience in his studies. He had also known from previous surgeries the way he compensated for this was to take a piece of muscle from another place in the body to wrap as a protective shield so he could stitch that around it.
Amazing.
In the process of just removing the bullet, the guy lost like
a lot of blood.
2 liters of blood. I mean, it just poured out. But they managed, because he had prepared this, he stitched it around and it worked. But that was another example of adapted learning.
Right.
In other words, he used his memory, what he knew,
right,
his training, and the knowledge of the situation to adapt to a different
It's
situation.
a pretty sophisticated workaround, isn't it?
So I thought that's just fascinating. And so, but you have to master, the basic skill set. And also what's interesting is here, he said a drill is not learning. In fact, it's a negative. To someone read something over and over and over and over again.
Right.
It's reading when you put it into context.
Yeah.
Into the framework.
Yeah. It's interesting how a workaround is actually might be closer to what we actually do on a regular basis. I don't know what the cognitive psychologists would say here, but there's certainly, even Levi-Strauss talked about this in his anthropological theory of bricolage, however you say it in French, which is basically picking various choices that are available to you to make a thing or to solve a problem or to create something else. So in the brain surgeon's example, and I guess the pilot too, they had very sophisticated machinery and tools and knowledge to be able to do that level of you might not even call it bricolage in the sense that it's pretty formal stuff. But I think in a lot of ways we are constantly adapting and making a workaround. I've seen this with programmers, people that I work with at work, who know a program pretty intimately, and it seems like they're constantly saying, "Oh yeah, I know how to solve that." In other words, the program, maybe this is poor programming, but the program is supposed to work a certain way, and then the person you'll come up with a bug or something that isn't displaying the way it should, and logically you go, "Oh, I see, that's right, the code, that's because the code did this." Well, okay, there's another way to do that. So I'll code it this way, and then that'll solve the problem. And you kind of wonder, I've always wondered, well, why does the problem exist in the first place? Something might not have been done correctly, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's really the way it goes. Life gives us the code.
I think,
and there's no perfect way. You have to adapt at every moment to figure out where you're going.
Life and who we are imperfect. And so there's going to inevitably be some kind of challenge you're going to face.
Sure.
And one of the things they say in here is this is a book about what people can do for themselves right now in order to learn better and remember longer.
Yeah, this gets back to the sticking part, right?
Yeah.
What's the sticking part of the title?
There's responsibility.
How to memorize?
Well, it's
Sorry.
making it work. In other words, once you've done that, that's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
The responsibility for learning rests with every individual. Now, what I found is it says teachers and coaches can be more effective right now by helping students understand these principles and by designing them into the learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you're learning the principle, not just the literal application.
Not the literal stuff, right, right.
So they also go to extreme distinction of saying they're not trying to form education policy. They're trying, although there's political policy implications of what they're doing, they're just trying to show how
it works.
Learning,
yeah.
you know. And they say we write for students and teachers and for all readers for whom effective learning is a high priority. And that is in business, industry, military, schools. The whole thing is learning is an ongoing process. You know. So I found this, and they said, one of the things they said is that learning is an acquired skill.
I believe
The most
that.
effective strategies are often counterintuitive.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Um,
I mean, you don't know how to learn.
well,
Right?
another thing is,
Although on some level maybe you do. I mean, look at babies. They figure it out. They're programmed to learn to walk, and one way or another they do.
here's some shocking stuff that they talk about in this book. We are poor judges of when we're learning well and when we're not. It's true.
That's
Rereading text and mass practice of a skill or new knowledge are by far the preferred study strategies of learners of all stripes, but are also among the least productive. You're not going to learn it doing that way. Well, we've done another program.
yeah, it's great. This was very interesting, talking about these ideas of freedom, representation, how ideas stick, and how you remember, and how you develop your memory, or not only your memory, but change your brain, but also adaptability, how you can actually learn to learn and learn to solve problems that come up that are brand new.
So thank you for being on the Rip Rap.
You're welcome. Yeah, great to be here.